Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to September's version of the League of Utah Writers Community Book Club. This month featuring the Diamond Quill winning anthology Street Magic. And we have a whole panel of authors here today that will talk to us about their stories and short story writing. And I also have a few questions for Lynn Worthen, who edited this anthology, about curating and editing anthologies like this. So hopefully this will be helpful for both readers and writers of short fiction. So if I can have you all start introducing yourself, and in your introduction, also maybe quickly mention what you write, and in a sentence, pitch me what's your story in Street Magic about, if you can. Let's start with Lynn.
Hi, I am Lynn Worthen. I am a freelance fiction editor. I edit for indie authors. I have also edited 16 multi-author anthologies, 2 of which were League of Utah Writers Silver Quill winners, and 1 Street Magic, which took the Diamond Quill this year. Under the pen name Lee Saunders, I write fantasy and science fiction of all sorts, short stories, novels. I'm currently working on an epic fantasy. In this anthology, I wrote the short story Spirit of the Law, in which a ghost helps a Boston police detective solve her murder.
Very cool. Thank you. CE, I'll start with you.
Okay. I go by C.E. Barnes. That actually is my name, so I'm allowed to do that. I live in Colorado. I'm told that I write speculative fiction, and I usually correct people. I write anything that can't happen in real life. That's where my interests lie.
Very cool. What's your story in Street Magic about?
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Oh, it's about a vampire who is in thrall to a 16-year-old psychopathic brat.
Nice. Okay. Douglas, who are you and what's your story about?
Hi, I'm Douglas Smith. I'm a Toronto-based multi-award winning writer. My story is Out of the Light, and it was inspired by me answering a question about, I've always been fascinated by shapeshifters and shapeshifter stories. I write a lot of them. And this one tries to answer the question, what kind of shapeshifter might be comfortable in an urban setting, as opposed to where tigers and werewolves and where lions are all in wild settings. What type of shapeshifter might be in a city?
Very cool. Okay, Sam.
So my name is Sam Robb, and if you're familiar with the acronym FNG, I'm the freaking new guy here. My second story placement was for Supernatural, or not super. First one was for Supernatural Street. Second one was for Street Magic with Lynn. And I basically was inspired to write a story about a Marine coming back to Pittsburgh and dealing with something that was fishing for people down by the river.
Cool. Jana, / your pen name.
Yes, / my pen name. So I'm Jana Brown. In this anthology, I'm Jenna Ray. Jenna Ray writes all sorts of speculative fiction, high action adventure, lots of magic, fun stuff. And in this particular book, I write See You Later, Alligator, which is about a woman who is hired by the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans to go find her personal alligator shifter who is loaded up with meth and running around the city.
Nice.
Poor Diana.
Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Guernsey. I write mostly urban fantasy and a little bit of sci-fi. By day, my day job is actually reading the slush pile for a few different publishers. So I'm the crusher of dreams. And my story in Street Magic is called Betwixt and Between, and it was inspired actually by a writing prompt I found on Pinterest. And it's about the enigmatic shadows that live in the between, and you should never make deals with them.
Okay, and Mike.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mike Jack Stumbos, or MJ Stumbos. That is currently the extent of my only public pen names. And I typically write science fiction with hope and humor. So delving into the fantasy is a little bit different for me. I recently won the Writers of the Future Award, and I have a series with a Mid-Atlantic publisher. I write This Fine Crew space opera series, and the story in Street Magic is Clarence Hemlock, Computer Wizard, about a digimancer, so a kiosk computer repairman who literally uses magic to turn your computer off and on again and make it, come back to life, who happens to find a curse embedded in a dead man's laptop. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, thank you, everybody. This next question is actually just for Lynn. I was wondering, since we're talking about like award-winning anthologies, you talked a little bit in the foreword about what inspired this anthology, but I'm also really curious about what's the process of curating anthologies like? Since you do this all the time, maybe give us a little bit of an insight on what's your process like? How do you go about that?
Well, curating an anthology is always an adventure, because when I get started, when I post the call, I have a general idea of what I think I'm looking for and how I think the vague outline of the book will be. But that will change, and almost always does change dramatically based on the stories I receive. For Street Magic, I got some excellent stories. And, there were a few of them that normally when I'm going through the slush, I'm dividing it into no's and maybe, no and maybe, no and maybe. And there were a few stories that right off as soon as I read them, I put them into I am almost 99.9% sure I am going to buy this story unless there is some super compelling reason why I don't. And there were 3 stories like that in this anthology that was like, okay, I am going to figure out a way to make the other stories that I'm looking at fit around these 3. That I will often have one story that I'm going to try and put into a collection come hell or high water. This time, like I said, I had 3. After I go through the slush and start looking at the actual final stories I've selected, then the anthology starts to take shape. There's editing, there's all of there's myriad tasks, from contracts and editing and layout and formatting, cover design, and all of this is on this massive Google Docs spreadsheet that I let the authors have access to, just so they can see where we're at in the process. And then we also put together a Facebook author group so that we can all stay in communication. I send out a lot of emails because I try to be very open and transparent with the authors about what's going on and where we're at in the process. And I've had the great good fortune to work with some wonderful authors, and many have come back and submitted to subsequent anthologies. So I think that means they like working with me too.
No one speaks against it. Good job, everyone. Giving good things. Ooh. Okay, I'm going to ask John's question here because I think it's relevant. He asks, for Lynn, for those who might want to edit anthologies in the future, do you use a scoring system as you read, or do you go by feel when you narrow down submissions?
Scoring systems are great for contests. For reading for an anthology, life's too short. I'm not going to go to that much trouble. It's when I am looking at a story, I can usually tell, well, first round slush pile, I can tell in the first paragraph. Maybe if you've hooked me in the first paragraph, you might get me to the second or third page before I, say, no, I'm not reading any farther. And if I'm not going to read any farther, none of my audience is going to read any farther. Your story is out. Thank you for submitting. Stories that make me read all the way to the end, especially during early rounds of slush pile reading, usually go into the maybe plus group, because the stories have to hit me as a person who is building this anthology as being a good fit for the theme I have in mind, going together well with the other stories that I'm looking at putting in the book. But really, I will narrow down the slush. I will go through the slush 2-3 times. If I get a huge number of stories, I might go through the slush 4 times over the course of anywhere from a long holiday weekend to an entire month, depending on how many stories I've gotten and how many passes it takes to narrow it down and keep narrowing it down and narrowing it down until there are stories that I just can't reject. They're stories that I have to include. So it's a lot more by feel. I read a ton. I have always been a short story reader. I keep anthologies on my nightstand to read because they will let me go to sleep at night, whereas if I read a novel before I go to bed, I'm up until the novel's done. So I read a lot of short stories. I pretty much know what I'm looking for, and I can tell it's more by feel, by instinct, when I'm putting it together. This is working for me. This isn't working for me. So.
Genesis, she keeps anthologies in the bathroom. Nice.
They're just the right size for what's going on in there.
I mean, yeah, like that's much better than checking your Facebook. I approve. Quick follow-up question, and I don't know if you have that off the top of your head, Lynn, but how many submissions do you get per anthology? Is there a ballpark?
That varies really quite widely. I have received as few as 3 or 4 dozen and as many as 200 or 300. And it varies based on what the theme of the anthology is. Some things just catch a wider pool of authors interested in doing it. I'm currently going to be closing submissions tonight, actually, for my next holiday hijinks anthology, which will be Madcap Mistletoe Merriment. It's a rom-com anthology. Because I'm putting this anthology together over the fall when I already knew I had a lot of other things going on, I did not open the submission pool to the general public. I only opened it to other former hijinks authors and a small group of other authors that I already knew and had worked with personally. So out of probably an open invitation to about 60 or 80 writers, I've received probably about 30 submissions. But that's a high percentage because these are people I've worked with in the past. But again, it's a smaller pool that I'll have to deal with, which means I should be able to get through the slush pile this weekend.
Yeah, that seems like a really tight editing turnaround too, because I'm assuming this is an anthology that's coming out this holiday season. It's
an anthology that's coming out over Thanksgiving. And so I only wanted authors I had worked with before because these stories needed to come in pretty much print ready. Yeah, it needs to be quick. That makes sense. Okay, thank you for letting me ask some follow-up questions here. I feel like that's always helpful for people to know because sometimes we're so stuck in that process of publishing taking so long, but that really, really depends on what you're doing. Okay, let's go back to stories. So because we have so many of you authors here, I really would love to know what everybody's favorite part was in their own stories. Like, what was your favorite part to either write or what really brought you joy? Maybe what do you hope readers are really connecting to in your stories? And I'm going to kind of like just randomize who I pick on. So hopefully we're all cool with that. Jessica, can I start with you?
Oh, absolutely. So a big part of my story, it takes place in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And a part of the inspiration was I watched a woman doing a walking tour through Halifax. And so I felt I incorporated a lot of those scenes. But what I really, really loved about this story is I did not intend to make it a romance. I'm a bit of a hybrid author. I'm not a pantser. I'm not a planner. But my characters kept, giving each other looks. And I'm like, will you stop? This is not a romance. You have a problem. He's trying to help you. But yeah. they wanted to get together, and so it ended up being, actually the romance worked in really well with the story, and it was very cool. I enjoyed it, and now I really want to visit Nova Scotia and go to these places. So it was really cool.
That's always awesome. Cool. Douglas, what about you?
I don't know. I like all the parts of my story. You know, if there's some part of my story I don't like, I usually get rid of it. All right, a less flippant answer. What I enjoy about short fiction is experimenting with story structure. I generally do not write strictly linear stories, you know, start at the beginning, go to the end. This story uses a structure of interleaved flashbacks, and I use those flashbacks to slowly explain to the reader how the protagonist got into the line of work he's in, developed the skills that he has, and also how he ended up being as broken as he is when we first meet him at the start of the story. So that was fun, because you're dealing with trying to keep the flashbacks obvious, so you know immediately that you're in a flashback, how to do that, how to keep them short, how to keep the pacing going. But also, essentially, it's a full of information question, and writers always struggle with that. You know, how much do I tell? How fast? And I like the ability to use the flashbacks to trickle out and to show, not tell, what this character has gone through.
Cool. CE, what about you?
I guess my favorite part of the story was actually when I figured out the protagonist's name. And honestly, it did not come to me until I was writing the final page of the dialogue, and it suggested itself. So I threw it in there and ran with it. I think that gave me the greatest joy, even more than killing the antagonist.
Very nice. Jana, what about you?
Oh, for this one, I love writing about Diana Mcdonough. She is a character that came into being in the early 90s, which tells you how old I am, on a mush. And I've played her in so many different situations. So now bringing her into short stories is a kick, because she is an overworked police officer, pulled into the supernatural, totally against her will. And everywhere she goes, people are screwing with her life. And all she really, really wants is to eat beignets and have everybody leave her alone. And they never do. So I love that, because it's always she's just a little bit fed up with the whole damn thing.
That's fair. Mike, what about you?
My favorite thing in a blanket statement of Clarence Hemlock Computer Wizard was the narrator. So just this particular character and his voice was just so much fun. This is one of those narrator styles that when I started writing him, I didn't have to pause to think about it. I was just like, I know what he's going to say. I feel very comfortable being able to rattle these things off. And I actually had to pull back quite a bit in the editing process before I submitted it, because there were so many self-indulgent asides that this really cheeky narrator who would kind of metafiction comment on the things that he was dealing with. And the narrator has been fun enough and has been noticed enough by my readers that this is the character that people will most frequently ask, you know, are we going to get more Clarence Hemlock adventures? And it's also the first time that people will ask that about my short stories where I actually want to say yes. Usually I'm like, nope, cool, end of short story. Like, you don't ask for more of a particular Twilight Zone episode to continue. Like, that's done. But this one, I'm like, I can keep going with him. In terms of specific moment, there's a bit where he actually gets to dive his consciousness into a computer, and there's sort of an opening monologue about how Tron and the Matrix got it wrong, and it kind of starts with that. And I had a ton of fun with it. So yeah,
very cool. Sam, what about you?
Probably for me, you know, one of the key hallmarks of urban fantasy is the urban element. I'm from Pittsburgh, and my story's set in Pittsburgh, so I had the chance to incorporate a lot of what I see in the city, what I saw walking around in the city. There's references to the riverboats and to various places, and just pulling that all together and kind of layering this idea that there are things going on just past the light in the city.
Sam, can you check your microphone? You're breaking up, coming in and out quite a bit.
I will go
I
ahead.
was
Thank
about
you.
to
I
say
will go
that.
ahead and change my mic.
Yeah, if you can, that would be awesome. So you're like fading in and out. Okay, Lynn, what about you? Since you also contributed a story.
Well, my favorite part of my story, I'd have to say, was there's a scene in the police station where the police officers are working late, and the main police officer, the main detective, realizes that they're not working late to the dim light of lamps, but to the dim light cast by all of the ghosts who are lined up along the window and hanging out in the precinct with them. Writing that, I wrote that, it's like, oh, that's really cool. That just made me happy. I did not know that was going to happen. So that was fun. There's a lot of darkness in this story, and that was a moment of light that I really enjoyed.
Always a good balance to strike. Yeah, cool. I'm also always curious, and I feel like it's helpful for readers who are also writers to know what everybody's idea generation process is like. So I'm really curious how all of you came up with the idea for your story in here in particular. And then if you want to address like how you come up with wider ideas, that works as well. And John, I'll get to your question here in a minute. Jana, let me start with you. How did you come up with this idea?
Oh, so I am one of those writers who has a chronic case of idea fariosis. I get ideas for stories and books in the dozens a day kind of thing, which annoys other people because they'll say no, this is my last idea ever. It's like, oh gosh, I walked down the street and came up with half a dozen things I want to write about. So for me, it's scoping through those ideas and narrowing out the ones that have legs, because there's lots of ideas out there, but some of them it's a scene. It's just one little thing, and so it's figuring out, well, who else does that go with? Where else does that go? So taking a theme like the street magic and being able to say, oh, I'm going to go back to New Orleans because that is a place that I dearly love. I'm going to bring this character that I dearly love who belongs there. And then it's looking at the scope of the story and saying, okay, what specific things do I need to hit in order to make this come together? And then I also pull a lot from, so New Orleans itself is an amazing place. And most of the things that I bring in there came from being there and doing ghost tours and looking at the history of New Orleans, because it suggests a lot of stories all by itself. The things that happen in the Convent de Ursuline, there's a million stories about what's actually going on in there. And so it's fun to say, these are the stories about it, and this is where it crosses over with what I have to do. So it like I say, mine is more scoping through the ideas and going, use this and not that, versus trying to come up with new ones.
That is fair. Sam, what about you?
I mentioned that one of the things that I like to do, and one of the things that inspires me, is walking around the city of Pittsburgh. And down by the river, a lot of times, especially in the summer, you'll see people out there and they're fishing, right? They're out on the river and they've got their bobbers out there, and they're trolling for the fish. And there was one day when I was walking past a lonely spot on the river, and I saw a beach ball floating out. It was probably the wind. I like to think it was the wind that was pushing it upstream. And my immediate thought was, something out here is fishing for people. That was actually fair. At that point, you kind of have to run with that and wonder what it is that's out there hunting people, and that led to the inspiration for something in the river that shouldn't be there, and then the people who deal with it.
Cool. Mike, what about you?
Well, for this specific story, some of it was just pulled from different things that I'd read in the urban fantasy genres, in particular, like, the Jim Butcher Dresden Files or the Iron Druid style things. But I was living in Seattle, and there were all of these computer repair places and all these tech people who would, take whatever problem I was having with my laptop, and I would swear they would click the exact same buttons in the exact same order, and somehow they would fix it. And I couldn't. I'm like, there's got to be some kind of magic going on behind the scenes here. And so writing the character who was super aware of that just became a lot of fun. But in terms of my process, I think that I'm going to be pretty similar to Jana in this one, because I tend to see things and have little moments of what ifs. And yeah, and if it's a fun vignette, but I don't know where to go with it, if I don't have a way to land on an ending, then I usually don't write the story. And I did a lot of my, I guess, my practical training in writing for stage to start. So when I was first doing that, a lot of it was I had to think through specifically, how do I get a particular cast of actors motivated to connect to these characters and present them? And so I needed to come up with these whole arcs for the characters that made sense to me and felt like something that somebody could sink into. And so the ideas go everywhere. If I'm going to write a story, though, it needs to be an idea and a curiosity and a what if that also gives me a sense of a character's arc and what a character is learning and experiencing. And so once I can kind of picture that aha moment that a character will go through, I'm like, cool, I've got enough of a basis to be like, I can try to tease this out into a story. It's not always perfect, but I am somebody who will just like, get an idea for a short story, click on the voice recorder on a drive and just like live record it. And so my first drafts end up being like, 30 to 90 minutes. I just go. They're not complete. I work on them afterwards, but like that's something that I do a lot.
We'll get into a writing process here in a second as well, but that's a really cool way to do that. Jessica, what about you?
Okay, well, I mentioned before it came from a Pinterest prompt. So I found it. I'm gonna read it to you. It says they stole things no one would miss, like time and pennies and sleep. And that stuck with me. I've had this pinned for like 9 years. And I always wanted to know who would steal time and pennies and sleep. And that's where the genesis for the shadows came from. But also the concept of between, something that is between. Because when you see something like out of the corner of your eye, it's not quite there, but it's there. That's the concept of between for me. And Nova Scotia is between the continent and the ocean. It's between English, Canada, and its Scottish roots. So it had a lot of between factors going on for it. And so it was just the concept of who steals time, what would they do with it, and what happens in the between is where the story came from. And then the two people fell in love, which was weird. I don't write romances, but my process is a lot like Mike's, except I can't write a draft in 90 minutes. He's insane. I asked the what ifs. I have 3 different apps, 3 different note files on my phone, depending on which genre I'm looking at. And I asked the what if I have come up with a strange, bit of conversation. I'm like, ooh, saw a car driving down the road and it had 7 dogs in the car and they're all trying to vie for the various open windows. And I was like, what kind of person drives a car with 7 dogs in it? Well, that's a story right there. And he's of course going to fall in love with a woman with 9 cats. It's just going to happen. So it's the what if that gets the ideas going. And also like Jana, I'll be washing the dishes. I'm like, ooh, what if mermaids lived in the sewer? It's really a problem. I never get anything.
It's a fun skill to have. I'm definitely with you there. Douglas, what about you?
Yeah, I'll start by saying how much I agree with Jana's comment. I think most writers I know, they are never had a shortage of ideas. Most writers are writers because they are constantly being barraged by ideas. And I know for me, they just sit in my head like ghosts haunting me until I write them into stories. That's the only way you can make them shut up. So this one, I've always loved shapeshifter stories. I have a shapeshifter series that I write. And this one just came up from I think going through my files of shapeshifter legends and asking the question that if you got were tigers in India and werewolves in France and whatever, what are you going to have that is sort of indigenous to a urban environment? What sort of shapeshifter might be comfortable? And that means they have to be able to hide in an urban environment. So after that, it was a fun story to write, but that's how it came up.
Cool. CE, what about you?
Oh, I wish I could say something that was like, original and astounding, but I'm going to fall back with the rest of these guys. I just eavesdrop on the voices in my head. And whenever I hear one of them say, wouldn't it be weird if, or say something like, why do people always? I snatch it and run with it. Wouldn't it be weird if, well, yeah, let's see what happens if you do that? Or why do people always, well, what would happen if people stopped? So I extrapolate from there and go to, weird and strange places with it.
Mhm. Cool. Lynn, what about you?
Well, I found a tool years ago called the Lester Dent Pulp Paper Fiction Plot. And I took that article and I turned it into a little worksheet. And when I have an idea that has been tumbling around in my head long enough for me to think there might actually be a story there, I pull up that little worksheet and I just start making the bullet points to see if there's enough to get me at least halfway through. Introduce the the sheet runs, introduce the characters, land character in a fistful of trouble, unexpected weapons or unexpected item or cool locale. Add some menace that will hang over the hero's head. Hero attempts to resolve the problem. The resolution causes additional problems. Shovel more grief onto the hero. Hero struggles, leading to another conflict, end with a surprising plot twist, yada, 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 and it goes on. If I can get at least halfway through that worksheet, I know I'll figure out the rest. The story has enough legs for me to take the time to work on. Otherwise, I might, if I really am liking it, but it's still too thin and thready, then I might find another idea, chocolate and peanut butter, smash them together. What can I do that's going to make it interesting? For this story, for Spirit of the Law, it really all came from, and I don't know how the phrase came into my head, no idea at all, but I had the phrase, the catatonic ghost, in my head. And I had to figure out why the ghost was catatonic and what trauma had caused it. And I wrote an entire story trying to both figure out what had caused the catatonic ghost in the first place and to resolve the ghost's problem. Because, the ghost almost barely appears in the story, but is a major factor in the genesis of it and shows up a couple of times in the course of the story. But the entire story was written for her. So, I will write to solve a problem. I will write to explore something weird or wonderful or wacky. Like everybody else, ideas are everywhere. And it's a matter of, just emptying out my pockets and seeing what random collection of ideas have fallen out of it this time.
Very cool. Okay, John actually had a question about anthology themes. He asks, what makes it harder or easier to write to a narrowed theme like this anthology had? Like, are there some things that help? Are there some things that hinder with this?
Well, it narrows your focus. You're not going to be writing sweet, fluffy romance too much in a hard-boiled detective anthology. My Edgar Allan Poe anthology was not looking for holiday stories. My rom-com anthology that I'm doing, if you murder somebody, you're out. It helps to narrow down the available pool of ideas that might be viable. And then, writing for an anthology theme, and an anthology will have word length guidelines typically. It helps you focus in on the core idea that you can cover in a particular range of words. I'm also going to hit in the chat something that I have up on my whiteboard behind me and have had for a long, long time. And that's that the first idea that you have has probably been done to death. Second idea, the reader is still ahead of you. You might be able to do it really well, but the reader's going to be ahead of you. The third idea is going to be, it's probably okay, but it might also be dull. Fourth idea, maybe you might have something there. By the time I get to the fifth idea, I've probably got one I can sell, because I just keep on going. Yeah, it's been done. Yeah, it's old. What can I do with this? How can I flip it on its head? So I love writing to themed anthologies. It's a nice challenge.
Cool. Do we have any other thoughts on this? I'm gonna just kind of leave it open to the panel.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
Go for it.
Go ahead, Douglas.
I'll be quick, but I agree with the win. I think this one was a reprint that I submitted, so I didn't have to, come up with something that would fit beyond looking at my backlist. But I've been invited to anthologies before with very narrow, very specific themes. And I'd have to say that one of the advantages from a writer point of view is I wrote stories that I probably never would have written if I hadn't had those restrictions put around what I could create. So yeah, every time you have a restriction laid on you as a writer, it's actually a good thing. It cuts down the number of possible branches you could run down and take off on. So I think themed anthologies are great exercises for writers.
Well,
I'm
and
done.
one of the clever things that Lynn did with this particular call is that she really focused on, as you should with urban fantasy, different urban environments. So when she put the call out, she wanted us to do cities that weren't always done and to really hit the urban environment, not to try to take it to a small town, not to try to take it to any of these things, but really and truly make it that urban environment, engage the urban fantasy. So when you read the entire collection, it's all connected by the supernatural, the paranormal things that are going on, but every single story has a phenomenally unique feel that is generated by the urban environments that we chose. Because Pittsburgh is very different from New Orleans, and that's very different from Boston. And the thing that the writers did so well, I'm the copy editor for this. And so I love going through the stories and going, they have captured the feel of that particular urban environment so well. I can picture myself there and then the urban happening. And so I think that was a real strength, is that by Lynn giving us the mission to really, really hit that and hit that urban part of the urban fantasy, it made for a better collection. We all did a better job because we had that focus, and those stories are so unique.
Mike, you said you had a comment.
Yeah. So I mean, I do like writing to narrow themes as well, because it can be very fun and challenge. But one of the things that can kind of throw maybe a wrench into the works is kind of the question of, are you invited to this one? Are you submitting entirely on spec, or is this a story that you've already written as part of your trunk and you're seeing what fits? And so something that I think a lot of writers, especially newer writers, have to consider when they're writing a story to submit to an anthology is to write something that they enjoy enough that even if it doesn't get accepted there, then they have a chance to try to farm it out elsewhere, or at the very least that they enjoyed the process of writing it. And for my part, this was a story that I'd already written prior to this call showing up, and I was like, ooh, convenient. And so it's nice when that happens sometimes, but you can't really tell. So sometimes I've written directly for anthos, and sometimes I have a story that I liked writing, and then an opportunity arises.
Yeah, Jessica.
Mine actually, my comment goes off a lot on Douglas's. His was much more poetic, and mine's going to be much more chaotic. I have ADHD, and having the narrow focus, it closes the windows that I can squirrel through. You know what I mean? And so it
and yet you manage anyway.
Okay, that happens a lot. But yeah, I really like writing to the narrow focus. I find that the stories that I write just for me or just for fun end up not really having a solid purpose. Because if their purpose is just for fun for me, it ends up kind of being a weak story. So when I have a solid purpose, I've got to develop this urban setting, I've got to have a magic system within it, then that is a lot more fun and focused for me with, without the meds than I could ever be with the meds and just going crazy on my own. But yeah, so it's not like what Douglas said. He said going down branches. I'm jumping out windows though, so.
That was pretty poetic, Jessica.
Okay, Sam, you said you had a comment as well.
Yeah, speaking as a new writer, someone who's written before, but this, like I mentioned, this was my second placement of a story. Having the guidelines and having the guardrails, right, was actually really nice. Instead of being faced with this like infinite possibility, what in the world am I going to write about? I'm like, okay, urban fantasy, want something a little different. And like Lynn said, the first idea, no, toss that. Second idea, and then I forget how many iterations it was, but got to the point where I was like, okay, yeah, I think this actually could work. So it's kind of like a writing prompt on steroids with a good motivation and good reason to get out there if you're thinking about getting into the writing business. You know, finding something like this is a wonderful way to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah, some of you already touched on some of the things that you're doing process-wise, but I feel like, again, if you have a variety of authors, one of the most interesting things to kind of hear is how everybody's writing process differs and what are some things that they do. Mike, you kind of talked about like recording whole stories, which I'm like, that's a new one. I'm like, okay, at least to me, like recording a whole thing. But I'm curious about what everybody's writing process is like. Where do you fall on the plotting, pantsing spectrum? It's not a binary. Binaries don't exist. Sorry, computer people. But yeah, where are you at with this? How do you tackle projects like this or longer stories as well? C, I'm going to start with you since I skipped you last round.
Okay. Full disclosure, I am an amateur writer. I'm not trying to make a living at it. So do not follow my example, boys and girls. I am not a good person to watch. I start by writing my protagonist into a corner and then getting frustrated when I can't figure out the solution. And I stick the story in my trunk and forget about it. And then several months later, I bolt up out of bed at 3 a.m. one night yelling, "Oh my God, that's how it ends." And then I go finish up the story and I'm pleased with it. It's kind of why I had to disagree with Jenna there when she was talking about, her way of writing. And if she just writes for her own amusement, she feels it's weak. I strongly stress, if you want to write professionally, if you want to do more than just scribble notes to yourself, you've got to have joy in your writing. You've got to love the process of sitting down at whatever medium you use, be it a computer, a typewriter, a notepad, and a fountain pen. But that you have to have this anticipation, this thrill that you're about to create something that's never been before. And if you don't have that enthusiasm, if you're sitting down thinking about, well, this might give me a paycheck, you're automatically putting yourself into a rut and a grind, in my not so humble opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. By the way, this was Jessica who said when she's writing for just her own enjoyment, it's like, but point of order. Okay. I'm like, wait, as a moderator,
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Here.
I apologize.
J names. Speaking of, Jessica, what's your process? Squirreling out the window?
First of all, I would like to blow a giant raspberry to CE real quick. I write for fun. It's fun. There's swearing and there's crying and there's banging a head against the wall, but it's also fun sometimes. Like when the check comes, that's fun. But I do enjoy the process. I actually, because I have ADHD, I kind of overdo the process. I actually have a 14-page document that I go through that has that lists out like details of the call, things like that, but also building my protagonist, inner conflict, outer conflict, their flaw, what is their wound, things like that. So and then I have my research, and I have a 14-page document that by the end is probably going to end up being longer than my actual story, because if I don't do it that way, I won't finish the story. I have to know how it ends before I can start writing it. And I know not everyone is like that, and that's fine. Y'all are weird and have normal brains. But I have to know where the story is going, or I can't start writing it. So I don't need to know all the signposts along the way. Those I can come up with, but I need to know where it ends, where I'm going. It's kind of like, I just drove to St. George today, and we maybe didn't take the same route as the friends that we were driving with, and that's okay. We all ended up at the same place. So it's like that. You might take a different route than what you expect, but you're going to end up where you want to end up. And so that's a little bit of my writing process.
Oh, can I go next? Because I can riff off that so well.
Go for it.
That's beautiful. Yeah, Jessica, I'm going to riff off a little bit of what you said. So quick first comment. I remember when I first started writing, I go to science fiction, speculative fiction conventions, and I'd always go to the writer panels, right, where they have a bunch of well-known writers, and I would sit there And I would be there hoping that one of them would let the secret slip, right? There had to be some secret to how, how to be a successful writer. And after attending not too many of those, it became very obvious, but I still learned something out. There is no secret. Every one of them had a different process. And I think for the readers, would-be writers who will be watching this, take faith and solace in that. Your process should be your process, and it doesn't have to be the same as anybody else. So my process, back to Alex's comment about the spectrum. The analogy I use, I stole from a quote by E.L. Doctorow, and he talks about writing a book or writing a story, writing a novel is like driving across the desert at night. You can only see as far as much of the road as your headlights illuminate, but you can make it across the entire desert that way. And that's sort of the way I write. I will write 2 to 3 chapters at a time, 2 to 3 scenes at a time in a short story. I mean, I've been writing short stories for so long, I tend to have the whole story in my head. When I started, I probably did do outlines. But generally what I know is how I'm going to start. I know where I'm going to end up. So I know my final destination on the other side of the desert. And I actually do know a couple of the stopping points, right? I call them tent poles, what's going to happen at the end of the first main act within a story or book, and the second act, etc. And that, so I can find my way to Jessica's point. I can take different routes to get every one of them to the stopping points, but I know overall where I'm going to end up. And the stopping points and that end target keep me on track. I cannot start until I know my characters, even if it's only one character. Roger Zelazny, one of my favorite speculative fiction writers, once said that stories come from 3 sources for him. They'll arrive as an idea, as a striking image, or as a character. Out of the Light, my story in this anthology was definitely an idea story. Shapeshifters in a city. But I still couldn't write it until I knew what character I was going to use to tell the tale. And once I had that character, I had to know. It kind of showed up broken. I said, okay, well, how are they that broken? So you ask yourself a number of questions, kind of sit down with a character and get to know them over a beer or a cup of coffee or whatever. But I need to know enough about that character's pain, how they got that way, and how they react to certain situations. I do not do character sheets or anything like that. That would drive me nuts. But I do know, if you ask me a question about a character once I start writing a story, I would be able to answer it. I would know what their key beliefs are and how they would react in certain situations. I don't care what their favorite color is. I don't care what their favorite food is, but I do need to know sort of if they're in this situation, would they save the cat? Would they walk past it? To what extent would they go to put themselves in danger to do a good deed?
Sam, what about you?
Again, I'm a new writer. I'm still discovering my process. And actually, Douglas just said pretty much what I'm starting to find out, which is I can have an idea. I can have even a scene or an image in my mind, but until that character shows up, I'll start writing and it'll peter out. So that's part of what I'm learning right now with what I'm doing with a couple of trying to prepare a couple of stories for other anthologies, is that I need to, instead of fumbling around looking for the character, I need to start with that right away and figure out who's the character is, what's their motivation, and what's their voice. And once I do that, it seems like everything just starts to fall into place a lot easier.
Cool. Jana, what about you?
Like to mute off. No, I'm a character writer too. I always start with, I have to have a character that I want to spend the entire book with, because whether it's a short story or a book, I'm spending a lot of time in their head and them in mine. And so it has to be someone that I want to win. I want them to get through the story and all of those things, because otherwise, if I don't want to spend any time with them, why would the readers want to spend any time with them? So I start there, and then I'm a mapper. So I treat it a lot like taking a trip from my house to grandma's house. And I know I'm going to start at my house, and I know I'm going to go to grandma's house, and I know points in between that are really important, that I need these in order to get to grandma's house. Because if I start at my house and go north, I will only get to grandma's house if I circumnavigate the globe, which is generally too long for a short story. So I know I got to go south. But then if I see a sign for the world's biggest ball of twine, then we might take a little side thing and go check out the world's biggest ball of twine, or the local petting zoo, or the ghost town right over there. So there's flexibility inside of that, but I have the guideposts so I can get back to them. That way I don't end up just wandering into the wilderness with my characters and not coming back to the structure. So I have enough structure that I know where I'm going, but enough flexibility that if we want to go and explore something for a little bit, and that's where a lot of the character interaction and romance and that kind of stuff happens, is in between those points. And so really I plot the plot, and then I pants everything that happens in between it.
Cool. Mike, you already mentioned your process, but do you have things to add to that?
Yeah. My processes they're all over the place. But I can definitely chime in on the dictation and recording side of it. I have to know what my characters sound like. I have to have some of those things that I can record and then play back to myself to be able to tell if I want to stay in the story and if I want to stay in this character. So sometimes I will like have what feels like that snappy end line that that the hero will say to the villain right before the climax, and that will be the first thing that comes to mind out of a story. I'll take out my phone, I'll record it, I'll put it away, and I'll listen to it hours later, days later, weeks later, and see if I still like it. So little things like that can kind of chime in for me. One of the things that I think benefits me more than holds me back by now, I'm also a teacher. So I've been teaching high school English, and now I'm teaching fiction writing. So for a long time, so I do have a lot of different methods in my toolbox that I can throw at things. But in my initial planning process, I plan like a pantser. I plan very emotionally. I like to just like throw out everything in my head and see what sticks. I call it a like movie trailer outline, where I will try to get like a 3-minute clip that I'm super excited about that has all of the biggest moments in my story, and then I'll record it to myself, and then I'll play it back, and I'll see if I'll still like it. And so those are the little things that kind of help me out. And then I get very method about it. I'm like, all right, I'm going to make sure that I plot out all the things that I need, and then I go through the writing process, and then once again I'm back to emotional pantsing mode, and then I get to editing, and I'm once again very method. So I switch back and forth, I think, in a way that wouldn't work for a lot of people. But by now I have enough experience with the playing with characters and with the teaching different techniques and methods that between the two, I know the styles that work for me. And this might change over time. But yeah, so like a lot of them, like a lot of the other writers on here, I know the ending before I start. I mean, like, I'm absolutely certain of it. That doesn't mean that it won't necessarily change, but I'm absolutely certain when I start, this is going to be the ending. Sometimes it changes, but yeah.
Yeah, having the start point. Lynn, what's your process for short stories? And then I'm going to ask you about your editorial process after that.
Okay, fair warning. Well, I'm creative, but I'm also moderately more on the analytical side. And even saying that, super heavy outlining just drives me nuts. Most of my stories begin with characters who wander into my head, move into the character condo there, and take up residence. I don't do character sheets or character studies or anything like that. I was never even good at character sheets when we played D&D. I just get to know the characters as I write them. Same way I get to know real people. And who says my characters aren't real people? If I'm trying to get a particular mood or feeling or cultural background for a character, I might watch a show that's a similar mood. I'm writing I call her a teenage bitch into the book I'm working right now, and I just told my husband, I said, okay, I have 2 scenes that I have to put this teenage bitch in, something from her point of view. So if you happen to see one on a show, call me, and so I can come and just see what they're like, because I haven't been around too many recently. Just needed to kind of get the feel for the character before I wrote her. As far as outlining, Dean Wesley Smith talks about writing into the dark, just jumping in and discovery writing all the way through. Kill me now. I could not do that. Drives me nuts too. But I'm perfectly happy to write into the dim. Can't write into the dark, can write into the dim. It's kind of, I sketch out a handful of bullet points. I call them lampposts. They're very similar to the car headlights Doug was talking about. Back in the day, we used to kick a rock from down the street on our way to school or whatever, and my lampposts are kind of like that. It's, okay, there's the lamppost, how far can I kick this rock, and I can go, and then I'll kick the rock a little bit farther. And so I'll have 3 to 5 bullet points for a chapter, and then I'll figure out the rest of the details as I write. And the story will often shift and change during the writing anyway, but it seldom deviates from my original bullet points by much more than 75%. So I'm good. So my process is, I just, start putting pieces together and shift them around until they fit. And if a scenic route suggests itself, I might stomp around a little bit because it's deviating from the plan, but usually it's better when I go with it.
It's always interesting. This is why I love that question, is that I think all of us kind of have our own processes with writing, but it's also always interesting to see how other people come up with things, because I think because of all of our brains are different, but all of our brains are inherently creative, it's really kind of like a choose your own adventure method, right? Where it's like, ooh, I heard this. Maybe this could work for me. I'm going to try this. Or some of us are like, no, like this process is pretty set for me. So yeah, let's talk about editorial process. I very often, both as an author and an editor myself, talk to people about editing and how editing is kind of like that superhero team up feeling. At least like for me it is. It's like, this is what makes you think awesome. So I want to know from Lynn, what is your editorial process like when editing an anthology, and how do you balance like working with authors one-on-one on their stories, and how do you work on the whole publication at the same time? Again, is that kind of like a process? Are there certain milestones you go through? How do you do that?
Well, I mentioned before my monster spreadsheet. It's project management 101. Every single task, every story has to go through a series of tasks. I think I counted it up once. Each story goes through 80. Each story goes through 80 steps. And depending on the number of stories in an anthology, that means I have like 1,200 little boxes to mark off over the course of assembling the anthology. And a step can be something as simple as, did I send the acceptance letter? Did I send out the contract? Did I receive the contract back? A step can also be, did I edit the story? Did I send it to the authors? If there were no changes that were of any significance, like just a few commas or something like that, or a typo, I don't bother to send it to the authors to review. I just make the changes and they'll see it later in proofs. If it's changes that need to go back to the authors, then the box of, did I get the changes back from the authors? If the authors have questions, we dialogue on their questions, or what changes they're willing to make, what changes I am willing to concede on. Most of the time when I choose stories for an anthology, I choose stories that require as little editorial work as possible. And that's not because I'm lazy, because I can work with a very rough story, but it's because it's not fair to everybody else. For me to put a whole bunch of time in with 1 or 2 writers, helping them basically rewrite their stories, when everybody else actually did the work up front to send me a story that was ready to be published. So part of choosing stories is choosing stories that need no to minimal amount of work up front. Thank you, Jenna. So, you know, I've already got stories that are in good shape, a very light edit on them. Jana will run a very light copy edit or proofread on them after I've put the anthology together. She catches more typos that I make than issues that the authors have by the time it gets to her. You know, I just try and keep very open communication with the authors so that if they have questions or concerns, they can contact me either through Facebook or through email, and you know, and be very transparent about the whole process. But a lot of it is simple, basic project management, working the stories through the spreadsheet, task by task. I do a lot of color coding because I'm very visual, and so if squares are filled in green, that task is done. If squares are orange, you know, it's running late. If it's red, you need to get it to me right away, you know. But I will be sending you reminders, or I might post on Facebook. I'm still waiting for 3 contracts. Can't publish a book without a contract. If I don't get your contracts by X date, you're not going to be in the book, you know. And I have actually had to send those notes out. So, because people's lives get busy, and it's as helpful as possible to, you know, keep everyone involved so that they can see what's going on as well.
Yeah.
I might have multiple names, but I'm really only one person.
Yeah, I think but having solid project management skills, I think is essential.
Oh yeah.
My ADHD brain also speaks to that, where as a teacher, I'm like, wow, if I don't have solid methods, it's not happening. It's like, what do you mean you need a contract to actually pay me? Sure. Okay, this is for everybody, but I'm always curious about, is there something that any of you learned from writing or editing the story, whether you're newer writers or more established writers? I feel like each project always is very different for everybody, but is there something that either in the writing or in the editing process you took away, you learned, maybe that was kind of like an aha moment for any of you in your stories? Jessica, can I start with you?
Okay, well, not with this one because I didn't have that many edits. And yeah, Jenna's right. Lynn's turnaround was just like, I got my edits back before most of I got a story accepted at the same time, where the other publisher had even sent me the contract. So she's really fast. But on a different story I wrote, I learned just how much I use ellipses. I never really noticed it. And that editor took out every single one. So I was like, but no, I love them. Put back the dots. So I have to really watch how often I use ellipses now. I'm much more aware of it. And also crutch words. I actually do a specific editing pass for my crutch words. I really like the word just. It is just awesome. So that's something I've learned in getting edits back for my short stories. But yeah, Lynn is amazing. I really love it.
I feel that. I teach my students to call them your hit list words, because as one of my cane using friends reminded me, they're like, hey, a crutch is awesome. Don't get down on your words this way. So now I'm like, these are your hit list words. Like, if you had to take out a contract on them, would you hit them or not? So yes, I feel you're also just guilty. Jana, what about you? Did you learn anything from this story or in editing in general?
Oh gosh, that's a hard question, because I've done a lot of these with Lynn. Lynn and I work together very quickly, which is really, really nice. So what came out of Street Magic? Yeah, I don't know that I have a specific one, just because we have done this. My edits were very light on this story because I know, and then maybe this is a thing that is a learned thing, is when you know a character and a setup and all that kind of stuff really, really well, it was much easier to write it without going off in places where I needed many edits, because that story was very, very tight. And very often when I'm tossing out the very first time that I'm playing with the character, the very first time I go to a place, then those can be a lot rougher, and so they take a lot more edits. So it was nice to see, okay, yes, when I go back home, when I go back to the characters and the places that I love, that makes for a much more streamlined story, and it makes the edits really, really quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I feel like that's definitely, like, if you've done this for a while, it's hard to pinpoint one particular thing. Yeah,
I've been at it for a long time.
definitely happens. CE, what about you?
How I guess I learned that Theodore Sturgeon's law, or at least the law that's attributed to him, 90% of everything is crud, definitely applies to my rough draft. But that in and of itself is such a liberating thing, because once I give myself permission to write crud, I mean, I embrace it, I accept it, then I get words on a page. And once I've got 90% of crud on the page, I've got 10% of good stuff that I can now start the actual writing process of cleaning up, polishing, rephrasing. I tell people that, that have told me, well, I've always wanted to be a writer. The answer to that is, well, right. Everybody's a writer if you know how to put words on paper. You want to be a good writer, you're going to have to do the work, and the work comes into the second, third through fifth drafts, knowing what you need to take a power washer to and get rid of.
Yeah, Sam just chimed in chat that you can't edit crud, but you can't edit blank things. Yeah, you have to have something there. Douglas, what about you? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies. I say I'll start by echoing everyone else's comments about working with Lynn. This is at least the second one I've been in that Lynn's edited. She's very organized and, yes, very fast and excellent to work with. What I learned from the process, the writing process, I have no idea. I wrote this story over 20 years ago. And from the editing process, it was virtually nothing, because I sold this story 15 years ago. So this was a reprint. And I can't remember what editing process I went through with the original magazine. So I can't really comment very much on that. I do remember one of the first comments that I got back on this story when it was still in draft form. It was in a workshop that Robert J. Sawyer was running, if you know him, science fiction writer. And I learned that you should never submit urban fantasy stories to science fiction writers, because Rob's a friend. I've known him for like over 2 decades. But Rob's comment on this, when I submitted it to him, he said, "What the hell is this?" So a science fiction writer commenting on a shapeshifter story. Yeah, but I'm happy with the story. I was happy I sold it. I'm happy that when saw fit to reprint it. And when I talk to some of my fans, this is often one of the favorite stories that they'll mention of mine.
Cool. Mike, any insights you gained from this one, or anything, any aha moments?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'll note, for the last few years, every time I've worked with a new editor, I will take notes on the things that the editor does, in terms of, like, the process of taking submissions and responding to the authors, and how they handle the edits and how they handle the publication, because I was like, I need to know the different steps people take, and I need to have a way to document what I like and what I don't like, so that when I'm doing this, I know what kinds of things I would want to do. So case in point, I'm in the process of so I have an anthology that I have edited that is in pre-sale right now. So this is the first one that I'm doing, like, solo as the lead editor. Yes, and there goes Murder Birds in the chat. Yeah, so Murder Birds, volume 1 of the Unhelpful Encyclopedia series. And so I'm pulling from pieces of editors that I've worked with. And Lynn does a very good job of keeping these spreadsheets very transparent, so I can, like, make note of the things that are going on there. And I'm also pulling from people that I know who've done very successful Kickstarters in anthology series, or things that are part of different kinds of community endeavors, where you're getting these authors together and you want the authors to feel like they're a part of it, as opposed to just, they sent a story, they may or may not get a paycheck, it'll show up on Amazon. So it's a more holistic process that I was looking at and trying to pull pieces from than like some specific things. One thing that I know for myself for working with editors, I really like to lean into a specific kind of character voice for any of the stories that I write, short or long form. And so different characters have very different crutch words. There are certain things that I just like, they're not in my list to search for, because it's not necessarily me as a writer using that word. It's me as the lens of that character or the mouthpiece of that character using that word. And so, yeah, so that's something that comes up a lot in the edits that I'm like, this is a term that this character favors a lot, or this is a pitfall that character goes into. But yeah, no, it was a great experience. I've been, I've worked with Lynn again, so that tells you something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's also like a good thing to be able to distinguish is this a voice quirk or is this something that is overused in the writer, which takes some practice to figure that out for sure. Sam, what about you?
Well, I learned fairly quickly that I was being incredibly spoiled because Lynn actually, I'm a computer guy. I love spreadsheets. I love organization. As soon as I saw her spreadsheet, I'm like, oh my goodness, she's got everything all together. She knows exactly what's going on. And from talking to some other people, that's actually kind of unusual. So I feel spoiled. I learned an awful lot from all of her edits. Just going through, and one of the things that I don't think I even mentioned to Lynn. I sat down and went through and looked at each one and tried not just to say, okay, is this good or is this bad, but what is it about it that made it work, that made it better, to try and understand what she had been doing. And there were some things that I was like, holy cow, I can't believe that I never thought of doing this. There were other things that I think were more stylistic, but I'm like, okay, that isn't necessarily the way I might have done it, but I think it does work here. And this is the anthology, the tone she's going for with the anthology, and I was happy to try and shift things a little bit to try and make it more in keeping with what she was looking for. But so I learned a little bit about what works and what doesn't in my own writing, and what it means to try and work with someone and fit what I came up with the, I guess, the story shaped hole she had in the anthology.
Sense. Quick question, Jessica, did I already ask you this or did I skip over you because my brain just went, I don't know.
You already asked me. I'm good.
Okay, cool. I was like, wait a minute, brain, like Abby, yes. Okay, cool. So I guess my last question before we get into like where we can find more about you and your work is, I feel like it's always really helpful for people to know, to learn any advice anybody has for people writing short stories, for writing them in general, and specifically for getting them published. Lynn, can I call on you first for that, since I think an editorial perspective is helpful.
I think everybody already knows what I'm going to say. Read the guidelines, follow the guidelines. Write, keep writing, submit often. I know I've heard so many authors who are just biting their nails waiting to hear back on a story they have out. And I tell them always the same thing. The more stories that you write and have out, the less a single story lingering out somewhere and or coming back as a rejection, the less it stings. The first story I sold, I honestly forgot I had submitted it because I had so many stories out on submission that when I got a letter back from the magazine, I was looking at it going, did I forget to pay my subscription fee? And I tore it open expecting an invoice, and it was an acceptance letter. I'm like, oh, hey, that's cool. But it was because I had so many things out in the mail. So the more you write, the better you get. And again, the less any individual story becomes a big deal, it becomes just part of, it starts to flow better. And then I'm going to, shill for you, Doug. Doug has a wonderful book on short stories. And he just posted the link to it, Playing the Short Game. It's pretty wonderful. So Doug can tell you everything that you need to know about breaking in short fiction. And I wholeheartedly recommend his book.
Very cool. Jenna, what about you?
I think one of the best things that you can do is try things that you don't think that you can do, or that you've never thought of doing before. The first story that I got accepted to an anthology, the rules on the anthology was that it has to be a romance, it has to take place in outer space, and you have 4,000 words to tell it. And it's like, I need a 2 point of view romance, space romance in 4,000 words. You've got to be kidding me. And I almost walked away from that one and ended up coming back and saying, no, I can do this. A challenge is good for me. And so I scribbled that out, and I ended up being voted by the other people in the anthology to be the lead story in the anthology because of the way that that story came together. So don't be afraid to try things that you haven't tried before. Yes, definitely within the rules, because otherwise you'll just get rejected. But to join in and say, okay, well, I've never written about this before. Maybe there's a genre that you don't know that you're good at yet, and you won't find out if you don't try.
Good point. Jessica.
Well, I'm just going to say, what they said. I teach a class on how to write short stories. And in the slides, I literally have the same slide probably 12 times. And that slide says, always follow the guidelines. Because what most new writers don't understand, and sometimes even the old writers, if you follow the guidelines, that automatically puts you in the top 15% of all submissions. I'm reading the slush for an anthology about mermaids. Do you know how many stories we've gotten that aren't about mermaids? I don't understand people. So, and also I love writing short stories because I can try on new genres. I said before that I don't write romance. That's mostly because I can't. I'm super awkward when I flirt in real life, that trying to have people do it on a page, it's hard. So but I wrote one. In the past couple of weeks, I've written a romance, and so I can try new things. I can say I'm still not good enough to call myself a romance writer, but that's how I got into sci-fi. I saw a call for a sci-fi story. I'm like, that sounds fun, and now 90% of the stories I'm submitting are sci-fi. So, like Jana said, try something out, something new. You might not know how awesome you are at the flirting scenes until you actually get to write them. So what they said ×2.
Cool. Mike.
I'll be a what they said ×3. As somebody who has been asked to mentor more and more people, especially over the last year and a half, in the short story writing game, one of the things that I find myself saying a lot to newer writers is that they want to try to get enough short stories in submission that they're no longer thinking about, how recently they submitted it. Keep a spreadsheet, make note, but like you're no longer actively thinking about it. And another thing that comes up a shocking amount to me is when people are like, I really want to get a story in this particular anthology, or I really want to win this particular short story contest. And I ask, cool, what kinds of stories do you like? What kinds of short stories do you like to read? And they're like, oh, I don't really like reading short stories. I'm like, well, okay, but maybe you start with that, find the kinds that you like to read. Because it doesn't take a super long amount of time. For somebody who already reads novels, you can find a way to work in some short stories. The other thing that I find myself saying quite a bit, and this one, some people might hugely disagree with me. I don't believe in polishing short stories to death, meaning I don't believe in polishing out all of the snags. I think that a lot of short stories, you need something that's going to be a little bit different, a little bit jarring, something that's going to break from the mold. And so if you're trying to polish it down to the point that it's going to be completely universal and nobody will find any fault with it, it's also possible that nobody will find anything exciting or memorable about it. And there's a very I'm not sure if it's a fine line or a vast desert here, but there's some kind of nebulous transition point between these two. But I have worked with a lot of authors who feel like they have a formula for short stories, and they keep writing to that formula, and it's very similar to a bunch of other people's formulas, but it doesn't stand out enough to get an acceptance. And so I'll ask them about the weird things that got them started on in the first place, the things that might make certain editors be like, nope, totally not for me, but might make other editors be like, I've never seen anything like this before. I'm super intrigued. So I'm in that camp. That one might be controversial.
So lean into your weird. Got it. Sam?
For short story authors looking to get published, just do it. You have an idea. Until you put that idea down, on paper or in a document, it's not going to be able to be submitted, and it's not going to have any chance of getting accepted if you don't submit it. I haven't gotten to the point where I've got enough stories out that I forget what's out there. I hope to get to that point, but in all honesty, it's just a matter of, put your butt in the chair, put your hands on the keyboard, write it, finish it. And I say that because that's been a problem with me, getting something rolling and being excited and then kind of letting it taper off. Finish it, get it to the point where you think, okay, there's no obvious gaping plot holes, and then go ahead and send it out.
Yeah. Douglas, I'm going to ask you, I know you have a whole book on this, but what's one main key takeaway? Given
God, so many. I give a series of three 2-hour workshops on this. And that's just on the marketing and selling short stories. There's so much, but everything that everyone has said here is right. So Mike, I think you said, you thought you were being controversial. I don't think you were at all. Over polishing. Dean Wesley Smith will talk about, he hates that word, polish a story. Because it's exactly that. You're taking all the sharp edges off your story that make it memorable. Okay, one piece of advice. I usually, when beginning writers, I say they fall into two camps. They're either the fearful writer or the arrogant writer. And I use those terms because both of them are sort of insulting. And I want you to think about them if you're a beginning writer. The fearful writer is the person who will revise and revise and revise and revise and will never send a story out. They tend to be the better writers. The arrogant writer is the one who will dash off a quick draft and send it out and can't understand why the idiot editor rejects it. They don't realize that they're not a very good writer and they're not willing to invest the time. So how do you move from one end more to the center? And I actually have a recommendation in the book. It's 3 strikes and out. And basically you write the story, you set it aside, you read it, you figure out what you want to fix the next time, you make those changes, you set it aside, and then you come back and you make the final changes, and then you send it out. So it's a compromise. Some of us, myself included, will take more revisions, but not too many more, because otherwise you are polishing off the fun, spiky bits that catch the reader's attention. And if you do follow something like that, even if you want to bump it up 4 times, I don't care, but set a limit. And then at the end of that process, send it out. And the other piece of advice, this will be controversial. You only send your stories to professional markets, only, period. And if you don't understand why, read the book. It's about licensing. Pro markets, the big markets, only buy first rights, or they license first rights. You're not actually selling them anything. They won't take a reprint. So if you have a great story, maybe the story that could kickstart your career, and you sell it to a semi-pro or even a for the love market, that's it. You will never be able to use that story to kickstart your career by getting it into one of the big magazines, because they don't take reprints. So write your story, get it out there, but when you get it out there, it goes to the top markets first. You keep going down that list until you run out of pro markets. And when you run out, set it aside, because people like Lynn will be coming out with anthologies, and anthologies come out all the time. They're a great place to also get your stories into markets.
I don't think that's controversial at all, but I'm also of that mind. CE, go ahead and close us out.
Okay, again, amateur here. But if I had to tell someone anything, rejections never killed anybody. Worst she ever got was a paper cut opening the envelope. Send it out if it matches the editorial requirements. Even if it just barely matches, throw it out there. Getting a rejection letter back, you might get some helpful critique or comments on it. Quite frankly, I was flabbergasted when my story was accepted for Street Magic. Lynn specifically said no vampire stories unless there's something really out of the ordinary. So
Well, it was
I
out of the
said,
ordinary.
thank you. Of course, that could double-edged sword there. I didn't know if it was going to be accepted. Well, actually, I was pretty sure it wasn't. But finding Lynn, appreciated the story enough to put it in. If I had been the least bit hesitant, if I hadn't been, I guess what Douglas referred to as an arrogant beginner, that story would be still sitting here on my computer with me going, well, I like it. So, write what you love, write what your heart tells you to write, get it there. Somebody is looking for it to put it in an anthology, to put it in their magazine. Maybe not this one, maybe the next one. Throw it out there. If it comes back rejected, throw it out again, throw it to someone else. Someone is going to have the same taste as you. Someone's going to love it, and they're going to put it in a magazine or anthology where a lot of other people who have the same taste as you are going to read it and go, dude, that was awesome. So
very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I want to add to that. When you get rejections, you don't know why that story was rejected. The editor may have gotten 6 vampires who are being controlled by bratty teenage girl stories and couldn't take them all. The editor may have had a migraine that weekend and just not taken anything. The editor may not like bug stories. I wrote one for a No Humans Allowed anthology and did not know that the editor really did not like stories about insectoid characters and said, "Ooh, I can't even read that. It's bugs." You don't know. You don't know what is going to, turn an editor off. You don't know if, any number of factors. And there are myriad factors that have absolutely nothing to do with your story. So don't self-select. Do your best to meet the guidelines and do something that is unique to you. Don't polish away your voice, because that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to round us out. Also, I always at the end ask people to share where we can find more about their work, and in the spirit of efficiency, since we have so many of you here, but also wanted to honor the people that weren't able to make it. Here is a slide that has everybody's websites on them. Please go ahead and check them out. I want to thank everybody for making it tonight, for contributing to this discussion. I think it was really valuable. And for next month, we are going to start reading for next year's Quills conference theme, which is Write Dangerously. And we're going to really lean into that idea of banned books and challenged books. And if you know anything about like the Utah banned book scene right now, one of the main ones that's currently on top of everybody's lists is All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. So that's going to be the first one that we're reading, because I am a high school English teacher and people have been side-eyeing me for keeping it in my library. And I'm like, oh, like it's on. So hopefully you all are down for some banned books discussions and for talking about like that whole idea of writing dangerously and pushing boundaries and what that means. The next book club will be on Friday, October 28th, 7 to 8:30 as usual. Again, thank you so much for everybody for coming. And I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. Oh, as I'm like.
Thank you so much.
There we go.